Oddly enough, even before the internet was very much more than a dream, it was quickly realised we were going to run out of addresses. The first presentations were in 1989, which is only 1 year after the initial National Science Foundation NSFNet. This was a bit of a shock because we'd already gone to this massive 32-bit space, 4 billion odd addresses, and to say, oh my God, it's going to run out was a little bit weird. But the numbers didn't lie. It was obviously going to happen. It was going to happen quite quickly. And so we started searching for solutions. And the period around 92, 93 was sort of this ferment, particularly of computer science, searching around for ideas on what can we do about it. And there were a number of approaches, and you're sort of all over the floor. Buy a bit of time. Doesn't solve the problem, but at least it's not a 1996 problem, it becomes a 2006 problem. And the use of classless routing was actually that time buying exercise. It bought us about 10 years, which is great. But we also started looking at what else can we do? And there were a number of quite radical proposals and a number of quite conservative proposals. Ultimately, we adopted for relative conservatism. Change as little as possible in the internet architecture. An architecture existed in 1970, and simply make the address field bigger. And not much else changed, and that's IPv6. So in terms of the degree of radicalism versus the degree of just tweaking the bits, v6 is much closer to a tiny tweak. But at the same time, there were other ideas that came out. And they went by a variety of labels and a variety of documents, but these days we call most of these network address translation of various sorts. And what it means is, instead of a packet traversing the network with a constant address, it moves through places where it almost changes realm and has a new address. And when the reverse packet comes through, the reverse transform is applied. Now, well, that's a bit tricky, but interestingly, there was one group that took it up almost immediately, and that was the dial-up modem business. Because when you dialed up your ISP, you got one address. But it wasn't long when you had 2 computers, 3 computers. How do you share that one address? Well, you need network address translation. Now, the ISP industry loved this because from their side, it was simple. Every subscriber, when they connected to you, got their 1v4 address. Didn't matter how big their network was. It was their problem to actually design these or put in these network address translators. Was it a problem for them? No, because all the consumer product had this built in. So very quickly, they multiplied. Now, the purists, of which the IETF has a lot, thought this was, well, in religious terms, an abomination. That this was a travesty of the end-to-end argument, that this imposed limitations on what was possible in the network and actually created a world of the second class, the third estate citizens who lived behind these NATs, who no longer had a permanent address, and the first estate who enjoyed their own, the servers of this world. And this idea of segmentation and segregation that was regarded as evil. NATs were all kinds of wrongness, so far so that for many years the IETF declined to standardise their behaviour. So to make matters even worse, not only were they a hideous mistake, or so they claimed, their behaviours were variable, which made application designers rip whatever hair they had left out, because how do you program to work through a device that doesn't behave well? Now, the answer was, of course, if we all ran v6, this problem would just go away because we'd all revert to the architecture of the mid-70s. Yes, because we really loved it then and it's worth doing now. There's something wrong with that statement. And there's actually something wrong with what NATs do and why they do it that actually is going on today. There are 30 billion devices out there on today's internet. There's only 1.8 billion addresses. That's an awful lot of address sharing. And indeed, the internet today runs on NATs. And to try and say, well, NATs are evil, NATs are terrible, NATs are disgusting, is almost like taking on gravity. Gravity's evil, it's reality. Get used to it and, get with it. That doesn't say IPv6 shouldn't happen, but what it's saying is maybe we should think about NATs differently. And one of the ways of thinking about this is it's actually transformed the role of addresses. For an address registry, this gets really interesting because what is an address? We always thought of it a bit like a telephone number. It's the permanent address of that device over there, and when something contacts it, a bell rings, and no two things can have the same address because then two bells would ring and it'd get very confusing. But NATs change all that. I borrow an address, I use it for a conversation, I give it back to the pool. And so it's not an endpoint identifier, it's a session identifier. And it's a very, very different role. So what defines the endpoints? Good question, names. Because now when I sort of go somewhere, it's not the IP address of where I'm going to, the domain name is what distinguishes it. And then the DNS gives me the answer of the closest data center, not the permanent address of the machine. Because NATs. Because we're actually in a more name-centric network than we thought. And addresses are not the number of devices. They're not a unique property of every device. They're actually just a conversational token that allow you to distinguish between one conversation and another. Oh, well, that's okay, very interesting, but when we do V6, we won't need that. Someone should talk to those folk about privacy addresses, because even in V6, the address you have is not permanent. Because with privacy addressing, you actually randomly generate a new 64 bits at the bottom end, a new address, at regular intervals. So even in V6, we're now thinking of a world where addresses are not permanent fixed endpoints, but are more ephemeral and their role is changing. Where do we want to go with networking? Is it really rational to have unique names and unique addresses? Why should we? Is unique names enough? And I think we're exploring that space today and exploring this sort of architectural dimension that kind of goes, maybe NATs, a bit like gravity, is something you've got to live with. And even in V6, we may well find it there because it solves other purposes and other roles, because there are useful things you can do when you're not tied down into a fixed address infrastructure. And that to me is sort of really interesting as a computer scientist, and really interesting when we think beyond IP, where and why do we go? Because if names really are important, we can do a whole lot more with that if we weren't bogged down in sort of the permanent address as an endpoint. And so this is why I think NATs are underappreciated. We're all used to hearing the mantra, they're evil, they're horrible, they're an abomination under some networking deity. I don't think that's right. And I'm not saying V6 is right or wrong as a consequence. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is I think NATs are underappreciated, and they may well have a more enduring role in networking architectures than just a stopgap measure between V4 and V6. I think there's more to it than that.